So now we'll turn from thinking about exposures to stressors to the experience of psychosocial stress. The Unnatural Causes video segment and several of the recommended readings do a good job of providing an overview of the stress processes that are hypothesized to mediate the effects of social factors on health. As touched on in the Unnatural Causes video, much of the empirical evidence for this relationship and these processes is derived from animal studies. However, we also have a fair bit of research on stress among humans in human populations showing that higher levels of stress exposure are associated with higher levels of neuroendocrine and immune system markers through both experimental and observational studies. So the experimental studies often are in the context of psychology experiments, and the beleaguered medical and psychology students who are the subjects of these studies have shown repeatedly that tasks that are contrived to reliably induce a stress response, like public speaking or a math challenge, have reliably and consistently shown evidence of physiological changes that reflect a stress response. Also, there's increasingly fairly rigorous observational evidence from population-based studies showing markers of elevated stress responses among those who are chronically exposed to daily hassles or who are in caregiving roles, which is very consistently demonstrated to be at high risk of exposure to stress and stressors. These studies also demonstrate to some extent, and the theory suggests that again, reactivity to exposure to stressors and therefore the likelihood of and nature of a stress response can be heavily influenced by biological and social programming early on in life. And so the stress response is something that can be, again, acquired or, if not, early programmed and inherited in life. And the acquisition of a stress response that may not be very high functioning can be a result of early life repeated exposures to stressors and stress. And of course, one example that is well researched of a maladaptive stress response is the concept of allostatic load. Allostatic load is closely related to the concept of allostasis, which refers to healthy regulatory processes of adaptation and restoration to homeostasis. And therefore, allostasis is referred to as adaptive stability through change, reflecting dynamic neurohormonal processes by which organisms meet and deal with environmental demands. And of course, a very intuitive example of adaptive response to achieve homeostasis is the process by which somebody consumes a sugary meal, blood glucose increases, insulin in the pancreas is produced in order to remove the excess glucose, and therefore, through this process of a restoration to homeostasis, the blood sugar levels go back down to sort of functional parameters. An allostatic load is the pathological extension of this process, the effect of overdoing it, and where those normal parameters cannot be reachieved. It's the physiological wear and tear in the body resulting from ongoing repeated adaptive efforts to maintain homeostasis in response to stressors. And it's through the chronic overstimulation of the allostatic systems that allostatic load results. It's therefore the toll of adaptation efforts when the mechanism is excessively strained by this repeated call for adjustment and adaptation, and or the failure to shut down those systems after the restoration would normally have resulted. And allostatic load, therefore, is best conceived of as a sort of measure of cumulative wear and tear or biological risk and damage. The articles by McEwen, who's really responsible for the most elaborate articulation of this model, and the measurement approaches, they article by McEwen is in your recommended readings, and also the article by Geronimus is another example of the application of the concept of allostatic load to understand black-white differences in health outcomes. So just briefly here, the way the concept is operationalized in studies is by using biomarkers to capture kind of two broad categories of physiologic processes. One is the primary stress responses related to or showing up through norepinephrine, epinephrine responses, elevated cortisol or out of whack cortisol. The secondary effects, secondary category refers to the effects of the primary responses and sort of the beginnings of pathological system operations. So you have elevated blood pressure, higher cholesterol, hemoglobin levels that are reaching or at pathological levels. Also things like waist-hip ratio can reflect the secondary effects of a primary hormonal stress response that are beginning to manifest. Also, other biomarkers, of course, C-reactive protein and others, IL-6, that reflect inflammation responses. And as a result, the strength, many argue, of the allostatic load concept is that it's simultaneously able to capture the processes operating across multiple systems, cardiovascular, metabolic, immune systems. Another strength of the measure, something we'll come back to later in the course when we talk about some of the challenges involved in causal inference around social factors in health, is the fact that it primarily makes use of subclinical biomarkers of pathological processes. This is a way of, again, strengthening causal inference about the hypothesized mechanisms between social factors and health outcomes. But by using subclinical biomarkers, some of the pitfalls or problems or challenges involved in establishing the temporal relationship or the causal direction between social factors and health outcomes can be avoided or minimized, something we'll come back to. But just to foreshadow this issue a bit, pathological processes that are subclinical, have not yet manifested as clinical disease outcomes, mean that they are less likely to cause negative socioeconomic types of outcomes. Therefore, it strengthens the inference we are able to make about the relationship between social factors like socioeconomic status and health going in that direction. Let me restate it. If you have high blood pressure or you have elevated cholesterol, but not yet really manifest disease, it's more likely that, and you find an association between that subclinical marker and, say, education or even income, it's more likely, relatively speaking, that income is causing that subclinical condition rather than that subclinical condition causing your income level. Again, something we'll come back to later in the course. Now, in terms of how allostatic load is actually measured in population health surveys, a number of approaches are used, different algorithms applied, and often in practice, the choice of biomarkers included to approximate allostatic load is data-driven. So the components often are variable, but whatever is included or available usually results in a summation of counts of biomarkers included that are at an elevated level, and then that summation is weighted to create a standardized biomarker score. Then the biomarker scores are partitioned into in ways that are empirically derived into high, medium, and low categories. Here is the diagram. I don't really find these very helpful, but this is from McEwen, kind of trying to portray the cycle of relationships between things going on external to the individual here. These would be the category of stressors, and then how these external stressors are influencing the stress response within the individual. So the degree to which these external stressors will translate into an individual's experience of stress, again, will depend on intra-individual variation. That will then result in whether there's perceived stress or the degree to which there's perceived stress, which then translates into some kind of behavioral or other response, physiological response. Again, also influenced by individual differences. Then the extent to which these responses are pathological or not, and the repeated exposure to these stressors will influence whether allostasis is maintained through healthy adaptation or whether this process then actually results in the pathological outcome of allostatic load. I think one essence of the allostatic load model that's very relevant here is it reflects a cumulative toll of exposure to stress and highlights the effects of that cumulative wear and tear on subsequent stress reactivity. And as emphasized by Fremont and Bird in the recommended reading, the process that we're talking about here is not just a matter of overtaxing or exhausting the body's response system through isolated challenges. It's actually, over time, a process of recalibrating the system's tolerance or sensitivity. And therefore, it fundamentally alters, in potentially a very negative way, the physiological response to future stressors that are encountered. So this is, again, an acquired process over time of dysregulation operating across multiple biologic systems. And so if life challenges are met repeatedly with insufficient resources or the burdens are too overwhelming, this wear and tear accumulates over time, creating, at the end, this dysfunctional machinery which is going to be less able to cope with subsequent exposure to stress. And this cumulative wear and tear is also articulated by Geronimus's concept of accelerated aging or weathering, which she has documented in a number of studies and theorized about, comparing health outcomes among blacks and whites, particularly between black and white women in the U.S. So one study here in 2006 is using NHANES to compare allostatic load, using that measure among blacks and whites in middle age, finding that black women consistently show a higher allostatic load that cannot be explained by cohort differences or by poverty. And Geronimus's work has really, I think, done a very important job of identifying the kinds of stressors that might be racially patterned, that go beyond even the types of stressors we'll talk about soon related to experiences of interpersonal and structural racial discrimination. The function of structural factors related to income and household dynamics, kinship relationships, and also the extent to which African American women are engaged in sustained and what's called high effort coping, which we'll come back to in a minute. And her work looking at racial differences in what she refers to as accelerated aging and weathering is really identifying a process by which this accelerated cumulative effects of disadvantage and stress are literally accelerating the aging of some groups relative to others. And this concept has been also really supported by more recent research looking at markers of cellular aging, telomeres, and supporting this idea of differential aging processes that are operating at the most basic physiological level, literally the cellular level, and but then having impacts on multiple systems beyond that to really suggest that there is an effect, a pathological effect of disadvantage, social factors that is literally aging the body at a faster rate than those who are not subjected to these kinds of stressors on an ongoing basis. And this kind of brings us back to the stress response part of the whole picture and coping with stressors and stress. And a simplification here is that you've got two kinds of coping resources or strategies, those which are salubrious and beneficial. Things like social support are often highlighted as beneficial coping resources that can mitigate the effects of disadvantage or exposure to stressors or stress on health outcomes. We also have examples of toxic coping strategies or responses that can actually exacerbate the effects of disadvantage or stressors on health outcomes. One of them is a kind of mechanism of self-medication, behavioral coping. We mentioned this earlier, like consumption of unhealthy foods, for example. This is something that's been articulated most recently by James Jackson in his theory to explain black-white differences in cardiovascular outcomes and depression. We'll come back to that in a little while in future modules. Also, the idea of toxic coping is articulated by Sherman James in, I think, the early 80s, this concept of John Henryism, or high-effort coping, which refers to the high-effort coping engaged in by lower socioeconomic groups to cope with difficulties, psychological stressors, but without the sufficient resources to do so. And so Sherman James developed a John Henryism scale for active coping. Some of the examples of some of the items on this scale include things like, I don't let my personal feelings get in the way of doing the job. Once I make up my mind to do something, I stay with it until the job is completely done. Sometimes if I feel like if anything is going to be done right, I have to do it myself. This measure, has been used to look at cardiovascular related outcomes. The evidence empirically has been inconsistent, but the most replicated findings have been with regard to hypertension among low socioeconomic blacks in the United States. If we put the whole model together, make it more confusing, we've got our basic components right here: social structure, patterning, exposure to stressors, which then may put people at increased risk for stress responses that then may lead to subsequent negative health outcomes. And what we have here is the stress reactivity component that can operate again as an effect modifier in both this process here, whether exposure to stressors translates into stress or the degree to which it does, as well as reactivity and responses here affecting the extent to which stress exposure translates into health outcomes. So here you have things like self-efficacy, coping resources, if a stressor is encountered, a job loss. Do people who have greater senses of self-efficacy, more social networks upon which to draw to tap into resources to help with subsequent job searches, etc. Those people with those kinds of responses and resources may have a lesser risk of exposure to stressors translating into an experience of stress. And similarly, once stress is experienced, those with different kinds of coping skills, resources, and strategies may be more or less likely to experience a negative health outcome as a result of that stress experience. On the pathway between stress and health, then we have these mediating pathways, these mediating mechanisms: accelerated aging, decreased immune function and therefore increased susceptibility, stress hormonal responses, allostatic load, toxic emotional states, and so forth. All of these physiological processes can be part of what's on the pathway between experiences of stress and negative health outcomes that can reflect everything from psychological distress, cardiovascular disease, generalized immunosuppression, making one increased risk for infections, for even cancers, and so forth. So this kind of puts the model all together with the three important components that we've discussed related to the stress process as it mediates the relationship between features of the social structure and health outcomes. Stressors, stress, and the coping and reactivity pieces here that may mitigate or exacerbate the effects of these more upstream and proximal exposures on health outcomes. Now, just to wrap up here, a few excerpts from the Fremont and Bird piece and the recommended readings about whether or not this attention to these intervening mechanisms, and here we're talking about these physiological and psychological mechanisms, is a good thing or a bad thing. And as they articulate, some sociologists have raised concerns that focusing on these pathways encourages biological reductionism and draws attention away from the larger social context and fundamental social causes, such as socioeconomic stratification. This could be a perspective that Lincoln Felon might be sympathetic with in their argument of the need to focus on upstream fundamental social causes. The contrasting opinion argues that The benefits of further involvement in this area of research ultimately outweigh the risks. Through this work, sociologists can help to clarify the full impact of social and psychological factors on health, demonstrate causal links between physiological and sociological processes, and provide a contextual framework for interpreting results. So I'll leave it there and let you decide where you fall in these two contrasting opinions. And that is the end of the fourth segment of the first module, and you'll hear from me again soon in Module 2. Thank you.